When I opened my Christmas gift, a crumpled $5 bill stuffed inside a grocery card, I smiled, pretending it didn't sting. Across the room, my son was crying tears of joy as his wife's mother unwrapped the keys to a brand new red Mercedes-Benz. Everyone clapped, everyone but me. Because in that moment, something inside me broke, and something else woke up. If you've ever been underestimated, betrayed, or treated like you were disposable by the people you loved most, this story is for you. Hit that like button, subscribe, and stay till the end, because what started as humiliation on Christmas Day turned into the quietest, coldest revenge I've ever delivered. I was 68 that winter. My son Evan had invited me to his home for Christmas, a sleek modern house that never felt warm, no matter how many candles his wife lit. I arrived carrying a tin of homemade fudge, wearing the same red sweater my late husband had once loved. It was the first Christmas since I'd sold our family home after years of struggling with the mortgage. A mortgage I'd taken out, ironically, to pay for Evan's medical school. When I stepped through the door, I could already feel the difference. Claudia, the other mother, my daughter-in-law's mom, was perched on the couch, laughing too loudly, wearing diamonds that could blind you from across the room. Evan barely looked up from his phone when I entered. "Hey, Mom, glad you made it." "Wouldn't miss it," I said, though something about the way he said "made it" felt like an afterthought. Dinner was fine. Forced small talk, polite smiles, a few jokes that no one laughed at. But I kept watching Claudia, how she leaned into my son, how he called her Mom so easily. That used to be my name. When the time came to exchange gifts, Evan grinned. "Mom, we got you something special." My heart fluttered. Maybe it was silly, but I thought, just maybe. He remembered how I used to save up to get him something meaningful every year. I'd sold jewelry once to buy him his first stethoscope. He handed me a thin, wrinkled envelope. Inside was a grocery store card and a $5 bill, folded like it had been in someone's wallet for months. "Oh," I said, smiling as my throat tightened. "Thank you, sweetheart. That'll be handy." And then, across the room, his wife's voice rang out. "Mom, come outside!" We followed Claudia to the driveway where a red Mercedes-Benz sat gleaming under a spotlight, a white satin bow wrapped around the hood. Claudia screamed, dropped to her knees, and hugged Evan. He looked proud. "You deserve it, Mom," he said, to her. I stood there in the cold, clutching my $5 gift, pretending the tears in my eyes were from the wind. That night, lying awake in the guest room, I couldn't shake the thought. How did Claudia deserve a car while I got change? It wasn't about the money, it was the message. But beneath the sting was something else. Confusion. Claudia wasn't rich. She worked part-time at a boutique. Yet, she had a new car, designer clothes, and somehow a say in my son's financial decisions. I brushed it off, told myself I was being sensitive. But mothers know when something's wrong, and something was wrong. The next morning I went to make coffee, and that's when I noticed it. An envelope sitting half-tucked under a stack of mail on the kitchen counter. Evan's name on the top, my address beneath it. Curiosity got the better of me. It was from an insurance company, something about transfer of secondary ownership. My eyes darted over the paper until the word slammed into me like a train. Property, 113 Maplewood Drive. Secondary owner, Claudia H. Rivers. That was my house, my name, my late husband's home. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I folded the paper back neatly, placed it exactly where I'd found it, and smiled through breakfast as if nothing had happened. But inside, I was shaking. I didn't confront them. Not yet. I needed to be sure. When I drove home later that week, my hands trembled the whole way. I dug through my own paperwork, every document I'd ever signed, the mortgage, the refinancing papers, the so-called reverse partnership Evan had persuaded me to approve when he said it would help with his business taxes. That's when it hit me. I'd been conned. By my own son. That night, I sat at the kitchen table for hours, staring at the old photo of him in his graduation gown, the boy I'd worked 2 jobs for. The boy who once called me his hero. I whispered, "What did they do to you, Evan?" But the silence offered no answer. Only the faint creak of the house that no longer felt like mine. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. My mind replayed every conversation, every smile Claudia had given me, sweet but sharp, like a knife dipped in honey. And by dawn, I knew what I had to do. If they wanted my house, they could have the empty shell of it. But not before I burned their little empire to the ground. I told myself I was calm. That was the lie I repeated to keep from collapsing. Calm people think clearly. Frantic people make mistakes. So I folded the insurance letter, slid it back where I'd found it, and pretended everything was ordinary while the hurricane churned behind my ribs. The first thing I did was what any careful person would do. I made a list. Not on my phone. Phones felt too public. So I pulled a sheet of paper from the drawer, the kind we used to write grocery lists on, and wrote in block letters. Evidence bank statements, mortgage papers, names, Graham Lott, Claudia H. Rivers, phone calls, witnesses, accountant, Tom, neighbors, Mrs. Alvarez, Mr. Keene. I dated it and underlined it twice because lists make the chaos feel like work you can finish. Then I drove to the one person I trusted who still knew the tangle of my finances. Tom, my late husband's accountant. He'd been retired for 2 years but knew every ledger, every odd clause tucked into joint accounts. Tom's office still smelled faintly of lemon oil and old paper. Comforting, the way a bookstore can be. He shuffled my paperwork with gloved hands and frowned like a man opening a box of something brittle. "You signed a power of attorney," he said finally. "Or rather, a document that behaves like one. It's labeled Reverse Equity Partnership." He tapped the page. "It's a predatory setup. They leverage your property against a startup loan, transfer beneficial interest to a trust, then, if done right, your equity becomes leverage for the investors. You're left with the payments. They walk with the capital." My throat closed. "Did I sign this?" "You initialed here," he said. "But look, there's a clause that suggests you were advised by an independent counsel. No counsel's name. No notary in the right place. This smells like a 3-card Monty." 3-card Monty. A childhood con. A street trick. I wanted to laugh and throw the papers into the air. Instead, I folded them with trembling hands and slid them into my bag. "How did Evan—" I started. The words stuck. How? How had the sweet boy who used to bring me tea, who'd cried at my mother's funeral, become the conductor of this quiet theft? Tom didn't answer with words. He looked at me like he'd seen something happen to someone he loved. A small animal trapped under glass. "You need proof beyond the paperwork," he said. "You should trace the money, listen to the calls, document everything. If this is fraud, you have time to make a case. But Helen, be careful. People who do this don't like being watched." At home that evening, I made a shrine to the past. Photos, tax returns, the little silver locket Evan used to play with. I touched each one like a talisman. Then I called the number I'd seen on the investment consultant paperwork, Graham Lott. My hand shook when I dialed. I wasn't sure what I wanted to hear. That he was a fraud? That Evan had been duped? That I'd wake from a nightmare and the papers would disappear? Instead, a flat, oily voice answered. "Mr. Lott's office," the man said. "How may I help you?" My stomach turned into a stone. I hung up. I couldn't pretend to be anything other than a mother who suspected betrayal. But suspicion is a poor disguise for a spy. So I became careful. I started keeping a log. I recorded every call on my landline. Old habit, yes, but useful. I skimmed through Evan's social media with the practiced disinterest of someone checking the weather. He'd posted photos of business meetings, a fundraiser, and one picture of Claudia laughing with a man I didn't recognize. The comments underneath were full of congratulatory emojis. No one asked where the money came from. Days turned into a routine of small investigations. I called the bank, softly, calmly, pretending to be verifying a transaction for an elderly client. A lie, but a harmless one. The teller's voice was clipped. "We can't release that information without authorization." I wanted to scream. "But I'm the owner," I wanted to say. "I paid for that house with blood and nights of second jobs." Instead, I learned the language of being blocked. Authorization, beneficial interest, trust instrument. Every time a door closed, a new phrase slammed into me. It wasn't only legalese, it was the language of people whose business was obscuring the truth. One afternoon, I went to visit my neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez. She'd lived across the street from me for decades and had the soft, direct honesty of someone who'd tended geraniums through wars and losses. "Helen, dear," she said, pouring me tea the color of weak honey. "You look like the cat that swallowed the canary." I laughed, but it was sharp. "Have you seen Evan lately?" "Oh yes, brought Claudia over for cookies. She's sweet as pie. But I did notice them meeting with a young fellow, slick hair, expensive shoes, coming out of the house late at night." She mimed a cigarette gesture. "Looked like business. Looked like they were hiding something." That word, hiding, felt good in my mouth. Evidence, no matter how small, makes you less alone. I started to follow patterns. Graham Lott's name surfaced again and again. He'd been in and out of Evan's office, then at dinners, then at a small clubhouse where local entrepreneurs rubbed elbows over smoked salmon. I learned where he lived, a glass house that reflected the sky like a museum of ambition. But the harder I looked, the more two things happened. First, I felt more helpless. Second, my helplessness hardened into a plan. For a week, I tried the honest route. I sat Evan down in that impersonal dining room, in the chair he'd been given by his wife, and asked him to tell me what the reverse equity partnership meant, like a child asking to be told a bedtime story. "Mom, it's complicated," he said, eyes avoiding mine. Graham explained it. "It's called leveraging assets. It's a way to get capital. I'm trying to build something." "A startup?" I cut in. "Your startup? You forced me into debt for this?" He flinched as if the words hit him. "I never meant..." "Mom, I thought we were protecting your interests. The trust would hold everything safe. You still..." "Safe?" I laughed, a brittle sound. "Safe doesn't have a secondary owner I don't know." He rubbed his forehead. "Claudia's been helpful. She has connections. She introduced me to Graham. He's a consultant. He knows what he's doing." "You introduced a stranger to my home title," I said slowly. "You introduced someone who signed your name as secondary owner." "That paperwork..." He hesitated. "You gave him power of attorney weeks ago. You asked me to sign something labeled administrative, and I thought it was for taxes." My voice broke. "Evan, why didn't you tell me?" He looked ashamed in a way I'd never seen before. "I wanted to protect you. I thought if we took care of it, you wouldn't worry. I thought I was doing the right thing." Doing the right thing. That phrase curled like smoke around us. He thought he was protecting me, but protection without consent is theft wrapped in charity. His eyes filled with tears, and I saw the boy I'd raised flicker back for a second. But then the grown man returned, one who had learned to accept easy answers for hard questions. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said. He couldn't finish. His apology sounded like a bandage slapped over a bullet wound. After that conversation, I couldn't look at him the same way. We finished the meal in a silence thick enough to cut. I left with the pretense of good manners and the private knowledge that my son had crossed a line I didn't even know existed between us. That night, I lay awake and replayed every memory. His first steps, the night his fever had broken, the way he used to fall asleep with his head on my lap. Memories are crude torches. They light the path back, but they also reveal the trash piled in the corners. Each memory now had a shadow. The Mercedes, the paperwork, Claudia's laugh. I began to wonder about Claudia. Who was she really? The more I poked, the darker the answers seemed to get. A pattern of small loans, a history of helping elderly people in the neighborhood, a string of houses that changed hands shortly after she arrived like a migratory bird that eats your garden and leaves. I wanted to confront her, to look into those wet, polished eyes and call her a thief. But confrontation with predators is dangerous. They circle you and smile like wolves. You need more than anger. You need strategy. So I became patient. Patience is not the same as waiting. Patience is a slow-moving mountain that rearranges the map beneath it. I taught myself to wait in the shape of plans. I started small. I withdrew cash, small amounts, just enough to be unnoticeable. I closed redundant accounts. I changed passwords. I burned my correspondence into a safe place. The practicalities of theft are mundane. Money moves through accounts and men with titles say words to justify it. My job was to follow the river upstream and find the dam. And then I found the first crack, a misfiled transfer. It was tiny, a 6-figure sum in a shell account that had been routed through a brokerage with weak oversight. It had the fingerprints of Graham Lott. I printed the transfer record and stared at it until my eyes blurred. The numbers were obscene and quiet. That night, I called an old friend from the bank, someone who owed me favors the way friends do in small towns. He told me the shell account was hosted by a boutique firm that specialized in alternative investments. They took a 20% commission and left marginal notes in the memos of transactions. One memo said, simply, property leverage, Maplewood. A map, then. I was following a map I had drawn myself. With every new fact, my anger mutated into something colder. Resolve. I stopped calling Evan as often. I stopped going to their house for dinner. He sent texts that read like pick-me-ups. Hope you're okay, love you. I read them, then deleted them. Love had become a brand name in their hands, and I refused to let it be repackaged. But the hardest part wasn't the paper trail or the legal wrangling. It was the loneliness. People don't like to cross family lines, even when the family is bleeding you dry. Friends heard the word son and switched sides without a contest. When I told a distant cousin about the Mercedes, she tutted and said, "Oh, Evan must be doing well. Isn't that wonderful?" Even my protests sounded ungrateful in their ears. I learned, painfully, that the world will choose what it wants from you. If you ask for justice, they'll hand you the duty of proving it. Then came a night I'll never forget. The noise at 2 a.m. I woke to the metallic bite of headlights through my curtains and the smell of rain. Someone had parked below my window who shouldn't have been there. A smell of expensive cologne and the echo of voices. I sat up, heart a drum in my neck, and listened. They said to check the transfer, a voice said. A man's, clipped, urgent. We can't have loose ends, Graham. Relax, came Graham's voice, silky and patient. Helen's old. She won't move fast. We have 24 hours before any bank flags the discrepancy. Make it look normal. My blood drained. Loose ends. 24 hours. Normal. The words were dominoes in my stomach. I grabbed my robe and slipped out the back door into the wet night. Rain had turned my garden into a smell of earth and honest things. I followed the headlights with my breath shallow and a laugh building inside me that tasted like iron. By the time I reached the driveway, the men were loading a crate into a delivery van. Boxes stamped with corporate names. They didn't see me at first. Their backs were turned, the collars of their jackets up against the drizzle. I stepped forward, and the man nearest me started. He turned, surprise widening into anger. "What are you doing out here?" "Lost my cat," I said, because lying once felt easier than the truth. "You wouldn't have seen a tabby, eyes like marbles, have you?" They looked at me with irritation that's easily trained when you're accustomed to being important. The man with the cologne, Graham, smiled in that way predators do, like a man who's been complimented on his taste. "Madam, there's nothing here for you." His smile thinned. "You should go inside." I folded my arms, rain soaking the sleeves. "You're moving things out of my property," I said. My voice didn't waver. "I have a right to know." "Your property?" Graham chuckled. "Helen, we're trying to help. These are documents, paperwork. You wouldn't understand." "And the Mercedes?" I shot back. "The name on my insurance?" He straightened. "That's irrelevant." Irrelevant. The word was a slap. The man in the drizzle reached toward his phone as if to call security, and I had to decide, fight or back down. I felt the old part of me, the woman who'd worked double shifts, who'd learned to be invisible to survive, rise like a memory. "You touch one document," I said quietly, stepping forward, "and you'll have more than paperwork to worry about." They laughed, the kind of small, mean laugh people make when they think you're theatrical. But Graham's eyes narrowed. Men who prey on others calibrate their cruelty like instruments. They measured me and found me a nuisance. They left. The van pulled away into the night like a bad dream retracted. I stood in the rain, chest heaving, and felt a hunger inside me that had nothing to do with food. It was the hunger for reclamation. That night, I stopped pretending to be patient. I became active. I recorded conversations, copied bank statements, and made a copy of every email I could find. I spoke to a lawyer who specialized in elder fraud. Discreet, expensive, and excellent. He told me what I already feared. These networks were sophisticated. They used affiliation and affection to disarm people. They relied on shame and family bonds to keep their victims silent. "That's their greatest weapon," he said, leaning back. "Family loyalty. People will forgive their own because it's easier than admitting they were used." I could have forgiven. I had forgiven so many times over the years. Late rent, silent nights, missed birthdays. But forgiveness is not a rubber stamp you keep using until it dissolves. Sometimes, forgiveness requires truth. Sometimes, it requires consequences. The closer I got to the truth, the more the world shifted. Evan called less. Claudia's social media became a museum of blissful photos, sandy beaches, glasses of champagne, a cropped image of her with Graham at a gala. The community, once my safety net, had become a hall of mirrors reflecting the image they wanted. A son supporting his mother, a daughter-in-law giving back. Nobody wanted to interrogate the pretty lie. Then, a week after the rain, the first official notice arrived. A letter from the holding trust, polite and impenetrable. The language was neutral, pending enforcement of equitable interest. It sounded like a funeral notice written in cursive. My hands shook when I read it. My vision tunneled. I thought of bedtimes, of scraped knees, of the nights I'd warmed baby bottles. I thought of my husband's laugh in the kitchen and the way the house had held us. Nothing in that paper matched the life inside the walls. That was when I understood the truth about revenge. It is not a sudden explosion. It is a slow, surgical rebirth of power. And that rebirth requires patience, cunning, and sacrifice. I slept less. I moved more. I spoke to the right people, the right names that slipped through the cracks when money is in motion. Compliance officers, a private investigator with a past in law enforcement, and a journalist who sniffed out corporate rot for breakfast. But every avenue I opened revealed another that was deliberately shut. Graham's shell accounts were layered. Claudia's name was a shade on a ledger, a suggestion more than a signature. Evan's culpability was a fog. Did he know? Was he willfully blind? Or had he been seduced by the siren call of easy success? The most painful part was watching him at family events, smiling in photographs with a woman I barely knew, or glimpsing him across the room of a fundraiser, shaking hands with men who used his name like an endorsement. He had become someone who would accept a shiny lie and not check the price. The escalation was not only legal, it was emotional. I began noticing how people looked at me now, the way pity hangs off a person like another garment. My friends said things like, "Oh, Helen, are you taking this too hard?" As if hard were a tune I could change with the flick of an emotional lighter. I began to understand how predators win, not by force alone, but by rearranging your social world so that you are the one cast as unreasonable. One evening, as winter slid toward its end, and the wind had that thin, determined bite, I received an unexpected envelope. Inside was a photograph. Evan smiling beside Claudia in front of the Mercedes, his arm around her shoulders. On the back, in a handwriting I recognized immediately, a single sentence. "You sold your soul for a car." No signature. It was a message and a dare. Someone wanted me to feel the shame, to fold and bow to humiliation. The paper fluttered in my hands like a gull, white and accusing. I should have burned it. Instead, I taped it to the inside of my kitchen cabinet where I kept my documents. Every time I opened it, the words glared at me. You sold your soul for a car. They thought they had already taken everything. They were wrong. That message marked the moment when my grief, sharp and raw, turned to something more dangerous. A plan edged with precision. I stopped telling myself stories about being a victim. I began to plot. But plotting requires more than anger. It requires the ability to wait, to bait, and to move when the time is right. I learned to act like an invisible clock, always ticking, always patient. In the quiet hours, I would imagine how it would feel to see them stripped of their little gilded empire. Not in a way that destroyed them utterly. Revenge is not about annihilation for me, at least not at first, but in a way that revealed them as the small, brittle men and women they were. I wanted the world to see the difference between the warmth of a home and the cold commerce of a car bought with stolen trust. I practiced my calm. I wrote down things I would say in court, in interviews, in the eyes of my son, when the world finally tilted toward the truth. I rehearsed my expressions in the mirror until my face betrayed nothing but a woman who had always known how to live simply. And then, just as I was collecting my pieces and preparing to move, something almost broke me. A late-night knock. A voice at my door. Shaky, familiar. Mom? Evan's voice, softer than any I'd heard in months. I opened the door. He looked smaller somehow, as if the world had shaved the edges off him and left only the outline of a man who had made poor choices. Please, he said before I could speak. Can we talk? Things have been complicated. Graham, Claudia. I didn't see it at first. My heart stuttered. The yearning to believe him, so strong it almost felt like an ache, rose like tide water. I wanted to take him in, to shield him from the shame and the mistakes and the consequences of being human. But I had learned something that shone like a blade. Sympathy is a dangerous currency when you're dealing with people who traffic in lies. Evan, I said, and I meant every careful syllable. If you're telling the truth, then help me. Tell them to undo the transfer. Tell Graham to return the money. Tell Claudia to sign it off. Prove me wrong. He looked at me with the raw hunger of someone asking for absolution. I will, he said. I promise. That night, he left with a promise that sounded like warm things after a cold day. I wanted to trust him. I almost did. Part of me still wanted him to be the son who had once painted my toenails when I had a broken foot. But promises are paper. The world had taught me they burn easily. 3 days later, the detective called. Mrs. Hale? His voice was clinical, efficient. We have reason to believe a series of transactions involving Graham Lott and Associates may constitute elder fraud. We've opened an inquiry. We need any documentation you have. Relief and dread tangled inside me. I had hoped for this, but hoped is a fragile thing. You're working on it? I asked. We had a tip, he said. Someone close to the case reached out. We can't say more. Someone close. My mind flicked to the photograph, to the taped message in my cabinet. Had Claudia left it? Had Graham slipped? Or had someone else decided to move the pieces for me? The detective's words were a promise and a threat. Someone had started the machine turning. The question now wasn't whether I had power. It was how much time I had before the predators noticed the net tightening around them. I felt the world tilt again, but this time it tilted toward possibility. And yet possibility carries weight. It demands choices. When the investigators began to ask for interviews and copies of my logs, I sat at my kitchen table and realized how exposed I had become. The law can protect you if you provide the thread that runs through the fabric of deceit. But the law is also slow, and criminals can move faster than the courts. Then, the cliffhanger that would change everything, a late-night message on my phone. Anonymous, brief. We know you're watching. Stop, or we stop you. No number, no signature. Just a line of white text that pulsed on the screen like a threat. I read it 3 times and then, because I knew how these things ended if you let fear lead. You know what I did? I laughed out loud. Not because I wasn't afraid, but because the laugh was a small admission of power. They were trying to scare me into silence. That's what predators do. They threaten so you will shrink. But I had been small long enough. The next steps would be careful, calculated, and, if necessary, merciless. I would play the long game. I would make them think they were always a move ahead, while quietly undoing them. I went to bed with my documents laid out like a map, and the anonymous threat glowing on my phone. I told myself to sleep. I told myself that fear is a fuel, not a prison. And in the dark, under the warm weight of my blankets, I planned. The detective's call was the pivot. It turned my suspicion into something with teeth. When he said the words, "We've opened an inquiry," the room spun, not with fear alone, but with the cold, electric possibility that the truth could finally be translated into law. That night I stopped pretending to be a woman who accepted wrongs as fate. I became a commander of small, determined actions. If you're going to pull a thread that leads into a nest, you don't yank. You trace. You map the web. So that's what I did. I started with people, real people, not documents. The investigator's name was Marcus Hale, a man whose office smelled faintly of coffee and old leather. He was mid-40s, with a jaw that suggested he'd once been quicker to judge and now preferred to listen. He didn't promise miracles. He offered procedure, and to a woman who'd been betrayed, procedure felt like armor. "Keep everything you have, Mrs. Hale," he said, and I loved him for that small specificity. "Don't confront them. Let us move quietly." The word quietly refreshed my strategy. If the police wanted to move quietly, I could do the opposite in the safety of planning. I would be loud in patience and silent in motion. I would let them think they were still ahead while I planted seeds they would later trip over. First, I strengthened the map. I collected every scrap. Bank statements, photos, call logs, that photograph taped in my cabinet, the anonymous text. I duplicated everything and sent copies to 3 safe places: Tom the accountant, a lawyer I trusted, and a safety deposit box downtown under a name that sounded like mine but wasn't. Helen Marlowe instead of Hale. Old tricks, yes, but useful ones. Predators prey on complacency. I refused to be complacent. I also hired a private investigator, retired from the federal service, gruff, and with a moral compass that did not require explanation. His name was Salvatore, but everyone called him Sal. He had a way of smiling like a man who'd lost interest in small talk because he'd seen the worst of people and decided to keep his own hands clean. Sal found patterns quickly. He traced Graham Lott's movements through receipts and hotel stays, found the boutique brokerage's shell companies, and started to assemble a chart of who paid whom and why. He discovered that the Mercedes had been purchased by a company called Crimson Ventures, which had a mailbox in a strip mall and a CEO who answered to Graham's phone number. Sal's report arrived on gray paper with clinical language and a single sentence that made me breathe in sharply. There's a web. It's bigger than we thought. The web extended outward in the way these things always do. Promises of investments, seed money, introductions to angels who were as imaginary as the halos they claimed to be. The deeper Sal dug, the more I understood how they had used family like currency. A son's pride, a mother's trust, a daughter-in-law's charm. They converted affection into access. Next, I built a stage. You cannot reveal a con artist by shouting. You reveal them by framing them with the consequences of their actions. I made the consequence look inevitable. One of the first moves was to bait them with a small, deliberate vulnerability. I allowed a rumor to leak, quietly, through channels that wouldn't immediately trace back to me, about a woman who had been offered a settlement. It was a half-truth. I'd been offered nothing, but the idea of settlement is a lure to those who think they can pay their way out. If Graham believed there was a chance to make the problem go away, he'd try to make it go away quickly, and quickly is when mistakes are made. I planted that rumor with Mrs. Alvarez. Old women talk, it's how neighborhoods stay alive. I gave her just enough to say at the garden club, Helen's thinking of a settlement. and then stepped back. Within a week, Graham increased his calls, impatient and clipped. He began visiting the neighborhood more often, standing in the rain like a man watching a tide he intended to command. At the same time, I wove a quiet narrative into my own behavior. I started taking walks at odd hours, noticed things I hadn't noticed in years, the way the mail carrier paused too long at certain houses, the courier who smelled of diesel and cigarettes, the barista at the cafe who had a ledger full of names. I listened, watched, and pretended to be the soft, forgetful elderly woman people expect. There's power in being underestimated. Use it. I also trained my voice. When I answered the phone, I let the tone I used reflect age and gentleness. People talk differently to someone they see as frail. They lower their guard. They slip into explanations they wouldn't otherwise provide. Graham, in particular, liked to explain things aloud into the presence of a perceived non-threat. His voice, recorded, would become a tool. There was a moment of beauty in the ugliness, irony. The same son who once bragged about his mother's frugality now looked at me as if I were a problem to solve. He called less, and when he did, his voice carried the hum of someone who wanted dinner recipes and not accusations. I fed him small talk and even smaller favors. Once I mailed him a jar of my homemade jam, because a man who thinks he has bought the whole world seldom inspects the corners. Sal and Marcus coordinated. The detectives ran quiet background checks, while the PI worked on the fringes, reconnaissance, following, a subtle pressure that made predators fidget. The longer they moved, the less confident Graham became. He texted faster, his sentences breaking into fragments. People who once smiled in broad daylight began to look over their shoulders. You'd think the greatest danger would be getting caught. But the hardest part was the waiting. The slow coagulation of facts until they became undeniable. The animal in me wanted fire, to call Graham out in a crowded room, to take the keys to the Mercedes and toss them into the river. But that's not justice. That's noise. I wanted something quieter and more thorough, exposure so public and precise that there was nowhere for them to hide. To facilitate that exposure, I needed one more thing. A witness who would tie the money to the men who profited. Finding this witness became my obsession. I started going back through the neighborhood, gently asking questions. People responded to the name Evan in different ways. Some clucked sympathetically. Some looked away. But one name surfaced like a bright, bitter berry. Jared. Jared had been a courier for Crimson Ventures for a while. Young, restless, and tired of being paid in cash and half-truths. He'd moved boxes, signed couriers, and seen invoices that made his skin crawl. Sal found him working at a hardware store, hands calloused, eyes wary. Sal made the approach, gentle and human, and Jared wilted under a look that said, "You can talk." People like Jared carry secrets the way rain carries down the roof, slowly, steadily, until the leak is impossible to ignore. Jared told us things that made my stomach lurch. He described envelopes of cash, invoices with names that did not match those on the companies he delivered for, and meetings where men in suits laughed about managing perceptions. Most damning were the nights Graham and a few associates toasted to closing legacy accounts, a phrase Jared didn't understand at first, but later learned meant turning elderly homeowners' equity into collateral for speculative ventures. Jared agreed to cooperate. He would testify. That one decision transformed the entire architecture of our plan. The police had a piece they could attach to the money trail. For the first time, I felt the relief of a rope anchored to something solid, but predators are quick. They sense the floor giving beneath their feet. They act first when panic sets in. Graham accelerated. He began withdrawing funds from certain accounts in amounts that suggested panic masking as prudence. Claudia's social media became blunter. Photos of charity galas, plaques celebrating philanthropy, a technique I now recognized as laundering reputation. Then came a close call that nearly undid everything. One evening, as I was returning a book to the library, I noticed a car idling across the street. The windows were tinted, but the silhouette inside was unmistakable. Graham, his jaw set like a man preparing for war. My first instinct was to flee. My second was to pretend not to notice. I walked slowly, then fast, then deliberately, until I turned into an alley and watched from behind a dumpster while the rain muffled the sounds like a gray blanket. He stayed in the car for a long time, as if waiting for someone or something. He checked his watch, tapped on his phone, sighed, and finally called. I caught bits of the conversation. "We can't have loose ends," he said into the handset. "She's old. She won't move." His voice carried venom, the kind that believes the world is an ATM. My heart hammered. If he was here watching me, then he knew. If he knew, then everything we had built could collapse in an instant. I felt the old woman inside shrink, a reflex from decades of being told to smile and be small. But the newer part, tempered by loss and sharpened by the clarity of purpose, held steady. I took a photo of his license plate with my phone and sent it to Sal. He messaged back a single word: "Stay put." The PI had eyes nearby, and within 30 minutes, 2 unmarked cars pulled up and a pair of officers approached the vehicle. Graham was polite but strained. He manufactured an explanation about a delivery. It was thin, but the officers filed it away. Predators are practiced at charm, and charm often buys a little time. That night, I dreamed of the house on Maplewood Drive, its windows like eyes, its rooms like the inside of a heart, and someone moving through them with calculating hands. I woke up with a plan so clear it felt like a hammer on glass. We would force a confrontation in a public, undeniable way. The plan required patience, logistics, and one final trick. The bait had to look irresistible. We created a fake document, crafty, precise, and believable, suggesting that a settlement had been pre-approved by a small boutique insurer. Not a forged crime, but a staged leak meant to prod a reaction. We would make it look like a settlement of modest terms, something ephemeral enough to entice Graham into acting rashly, but solid enough to show investigators how he tried to obfuscate. I felt like a director, dressing a stage, arranging lights. The actors were real people with real greed. The difference between theater and life was the stakes. Here, a man's future and a woman's dignity were the currency. When the bait was set, we waited. Days crawled. Then, like the snap of a trap, he moved. Graham, in his arrogance, made an error. He attempted to move funds from the Shell account to a personal holding account in the dead of night. He assumed secrecy would cloak him. But Jared, the courier, had been listening. Jared recorded a phone call, a flustered, panicked conversation where Graham said the words, "Move it through Crimson, then slice it into smaller wires. Claudia will handle the paperwork." It was the phrase I'd been waiting for, a direct, audible link between the money, the consultant, and the woman who sat in my son's living room and smiled when I unwrapped $5. The recording was filed with Marcus. The police moved. It was not a cinematic arrest, no dramatic shouting or cuffs in the snow. Justice often wears a gray suit and moves in sober steps. One morning, men in suits arrived at Graham's glass house. He tried to compose himself, but the shuffle of officers and the clink of handcuffs was a sound that sings like a bell through the chest, final and irreversible. Claudia wasn't arrested that day. The net tightened around her gradually. She called me once, an odd, brittle voice. "Helen," she said, like a child reciting someone else's lines. "I think you should know. I had nothing to do with—" The line went dead before she finished. It was a sound like an animal departing the scene of a wreck, quick, shameful, and final. Evan called after Graham's arrest. His voice was raw, ragged. "Mom, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." He wanted absolution. He wanted me to stand in front of him and say the worst was over. But pain is not a switch you can flick off. It requires exposure and repair. I told him to speak with Marcus. I told him to meet with Tom. I told him the truth. Help me undo this, or watch what you helped create collapse around you. He did both. He sat in Marcus's office and let the truth be a salve and a brand. He signed forms to reverse at least some of the transfers and shut down accounts he controlled. His hands shook so badly the pen rattled. Watching him, I felt something like a wound opening, and perhaps the beginning of healing. Not for us, not yet, but for the truth. But the true turning point wasn't Graham's arrest or Jared's testimony. It was the moment I saw the look on Claudia's face when her curated life, a collage of designer bags and gleaming cars, began to show cracks. She came to my neighborhood in a flurry one afternoon, lashes heavy, lipstick sharp, and for the first time she couldn't manufacture the right expression. She looked thin, not from hunger but from stress. Wealth erodes the body that is not used to earning it honestly. She found me by the garden, pretending to trim my roses. I smelled her perfume before she reached me, cheap jasmine, trying to pass as something more. When she stood before me, she had the audacity to tilt her head and ask, "Why are people saying things, Helen? Are you spreading rumors?" She spoke like a woman used to commanding the room, but the room had shrunk. I saw it then. A woman who'd bet everything on charm and lost. Her voice was a practiced melody with a crack in it. "Claudia," I said, and I chose my words with care. "You got a lot of things wrong, but you also got one thing very right. You knew how to make people look away. That habit ends now." She laughed, a brittle sound. "You're delusional." I smiled. "Maybe. Or maybe I just learned how to count money properly." She reached for her phone, as if to call someone, to spin things her way. I said 2 words that would haunt her like a small hammer. "You lied." Her reaction was small but sharp. Her shoulders went up, then down. She left quickly after that, heels clacking like a metronome counting down. In the weeks that followed, paperwork moved in slow, satisfying ways. Trustees resigned, banks froze accounts, and the investigator's careful hand did what justice requires: methodical, relentless paperwork that strips a lie of its shiny veneer. The community that had once smiled at Claudia's generosity now saw the smallness behind the gift wrap. People remembered a million small things that had looked harmless at the time. A check here, a favor there, and suddenly, those things were suspicious. And me? I watched from a distance as the machinery I'd set in motion closed. I'd never imagined how quiet the satisfaction would be. Not a roar, but a deep, interior settling. I slept better, for the first time in months. The ocean still haunted me in sleep, but now it was a horizon, not an escape. Yet even as the net tightened, a final dangerous wind began to blow. I had thought we had enough to bring Claudia to account. I had Jared's testimony, Graham's recording, and Evan's cooperation. But Claudia reacted the way cornered animals do. She struck outward, not inward. She hired a lawyer with expensive teeth and began to set up defenses no one expected. She talked of misunderstanding, good intentions, and complex financial instruments. She leaned into sympathy like a buffoonery of performance. She also, somewhere along the line, found allies. A few community members who'd benefited from her largesse now defended her publicly, pulling memories of donated funds like scarves around their shoulders. People love a benefactor, and generosity is a handy shield against investigation. The court of public opinion split, and between those fractures I understood the final truth. Legal victory is only part of justice. The other part is the quiet unmasking that stays with people, the whispered recalibration of who they trust. I'd won legal steps, but the social calculus remained messy. I had to be prepared for more skirmishes, more legal maneuvers, and the painful lesson that exposing someone doesn't instantly mend all the hurts. And then, just as we were preparing to move forward with filings and public statements, came the cliff that makes even the most careful plan wobble: a subpoena. It was directed at me. They wanted my depositions, my notes, my every conversation detailed, and they wanted it fast. Claudia's lawyers were digging now with the good money of fear and arrogance. They wanted to discredit me, to paint a portrait of a bitter mother with an axe to grind. Their strategy was old and effective: make the victim seem unreasonable. I sat in Marcus's office when his assistant slid the subpoena across the table like an invitation to a duel. Our eyes met. He looked tired, but his jaw had that same set it had the first time he told me they'd opened an inquiry. We'll prep you, he said. Tell the truth. We'll stand by it. Truth. The word vibrated in the room like a bell. I thought about all the times I'd been asked to give up pieces of myself for a lie, to mortgage my dignity, to smile at betrayals, to accept crumbs. I had learned how to be small, but this time I would not. I spent days rewriting my testimony in my head, rehearsing the cadence of facts, smoothing the jagged edges without dulling the bite. I practiced saying things aloud. I did not consent to this transfer. I did not understand the document until they sounded like iron. My internal monologue became a metronome to steady my nerves. On the morning of my deposition, the world outside was crisp and indifferent. I wore the sweater my husband had liked and a face that said calm. The lawyer for Claudia arrived with a lean smile and the practiced politeness of someone who knows how to weaponize niceness. He asked questions like, he set little traps, soft, polite, designed to make me contradict myself. Mrs. Hale, he said, isn't it true you signed these papers? You initialed them, did you not? Yes, I said. The word landed like a rock. Because I trusted the people who brought them, but I did not understand the nature of what I signed. And you didn't read them? He pressed. I read what I could, I said. But they told me, Graham and Evan, that these were administrative documents. They convinced me the trust would protect the house. I wasn't given independent legal counsel. He smiled, like a man who finds honey. So you assert you were misled? Yes, I said. I assert I was misled. He kept attacking. He painted me as emotional, indecisive, vulnerable, and therefore unreliably human. I kept answering, steady and true. Marcus interjected when the lawyer grew cruel, and Tom sat behind me with his arms folded like a shield. The testimony was not easy, but I made sure my facts were bulletproof. Copies of wire transfers, timestamps, Jared's testimony, Graham's recorded admissions. Each was a nail in a coffin of falsehoods. At the end of the day, the lawyer left with a face that had lost a bit of its practiced sheen. I went home exhausted and oddly triumphant. The legal theater had its ugliness, but truth dug deep roots even in poor soil. As I walked back to my station wagon, the sky split open with rain, and for once the weather matched the feeling inside me, raw, cleansing, relentless. I knew the final act was near. I could feel it in the rhythm of calls, in the way Graham's name was now a common subject in corporate memos, in the slight stutter in Claudia's voice when she asked people for favors. The predators had been startled into motion, but they were not yet broken. There would be more lawyers, more motions, perhaps appeals. The justice we'd initiated had an endurance test ahead. But I had done the thing I set out to do. I had forced the truth into a space where it could not be easily ignored. I had taken the humiliation of a crumpled $5 bill and converted it into a dossier heavy enough to topple illusions. The sting, the planning, the patience. They had not been an act of vengeance for vengeance's sake. They had been reclamation. I hadn't taken everything from those who'd hurt me. I had taken the lie they'd fed me and returned it to them, folded and silent, so they could see the shape of it in their own hands. And yet, as the last days of Part 3 closed, there remained a final danger. The human factor. People can change, and sometimes they do, but not always the way you hope. There was one last scene waiting, one final move in which someone I loved would have to choose between convenience and conscience. I went to bed that night certain of two things, that the net was closing, and that when it snapped shut, it would reveal more than wealth, it would reveal character. The morning the net snapped shut began like any other. I woke to sunlight slicing through the blinds, the hum of the ocean a distant, steady pulse. But I wasn't stretching or sipping coffee. I was reviewing the last of the documents one more time. Each page a promise, each ledger a tiny hammer striking reality into the lives of those who had tried to steal mine. By mid-morning, Graham Lott was gone from his sleek glass office. Rumors whispered across the city. Unmarked vans, hurried movements, abrupt exits. He had been arrested, quietly, efficiently. Marcus had been there to see it happen, a legal ballet that made the predator's world contract in minutes. There were no sirens, no shouting, no dramatic collapse, just the methodical inevitability of law catching up to the arrogance of men. Claudia, on the other hand, was still loose. Her calls came, brittle and frantic. I didn't answer. She left messages like bullets, each word dripping with desperation. "Helen, we can fix this. Just talk to me." I kept my silence. Silence was my weapon now. Words had betrayed me for decades. Quiet, deliberate action would redeem them. Evan called once, tentative, and for the first time I didn't pick up. My heart twisted, but my mind was sharper than guilt. He had chosen convenience over conscience once, and now it was his turn to face consequences. He was forced to handle the unraveling of his own decisions, his finances frozen, his investments questioned, his reputation fractured. The man who had once looked at me with indulgent pride now avoided my eyes, even over the phone. The son I had nurtured, taught, and sacrificed for had learned the price of greed too late. I moved quietly through the city, collecting the final threads. Banks froze accounts, documents were subpoenaed, and investigators traced each wire. Jared's testimony tied Graham and Claudia to the money with a clarity that even the most seasoned lawyers could not obscure. I watched it all unfold from the vantage point of my coastal town, miles away, and felt the slow bloom of justice without fanfare. The real thrill came when Claudia attempted to regain control. She made a desperate move, trying to claim my house through a forged amendment, thinking that I had been careless. I had anticipated it. I had the original paperwork, every transfer documented, every bank statement secured. When her lawyer approached my new address, I handed over a single envelope marked, "Read carefully before filing." Inside was the proof of her fraud, meticulously annotated. By the time she realized her maneuver had failed, the law had already enveloped her like an unyielding tide. Evan finally showed up at my doorstep months later. He stood there, the man who had once demanded so much, looking smaller than ever. The weight of shame, the exposure of truth, and the collapse of everything he had been proud of pressed down on him. He tried to explain, to apologize, to justify, but I simply handed him a note, the same note I had left in the house before I sold it. "You sold your soul for a car." No words followed, no lectures, just truth, cold and simple, like the ocean outside my new window. Community whispers began to shift. People who had once admired Claudia's generosity now saw the pattern behind the glitter. Favors exchanged for influence, smiles traded for access, and manipulation disguised as kindness. Social media feeds carried the story quietly at first, then the local news picked it up. Headlines didn't shout my victory, they merely chronicled it. But the effect was undeniable. The predators were exposed, and the ripple extended beyond what even I had expected. The Mercedes-Benz, the symbol of arrogance, was quietly repossessed. Graham faced charges of wire fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy. Claudia, once the queen of perception, had her assets frozen, her credibility shredded. And Evan, my son, faced a reality he had never been prepared for. That complicity carries consequences. His pride had cost him, and the lesson was merciless. I did not attend court. I watched from my small coastal town, the waves crashing against the rocks below, a steady rhythm that echoed the calm after the storm. I had no need for drama, no desire for applause. The satisfaction was quiet, measured, and complete. My revenge had been surgical, precise, and deserved. It was justice wrapped in patience and meticulous planning, not anger. At night, I walked along the beach, the cold wind biting my cheeks. I thought about the years of sacrifice, the nights of worry over Evan's future, the quiet despair of seeing a loved one manipulated by a stranger. And then I thought about the freedom, the pure, untainted freedom that comes from reclaiming your life. I had learned a bitter truth. Family can love you, or they can betray you. Sometimes they do both in the same heartbeat, but only you decide which will define you. I chose freedom, dignity, and the knowledge that I had survived and triumphed without losing myself. The ocean whispered its approval, a steady, eternal witness. I was no longer Helen, the woman who had been betrayed in a holiday moment of humiliation. I was Helen, the woman who had outsmarted predators, exposed lies, and reclaimed her life on her own terms. And for the first time in decades, I felt the weight of peace settle across my shoulders like a warm, steady blanket. As the sun set, the horizon painted in violent streaks of orange and violet, I smiled. The crumpled $5 bill had been the spark, but the fire it ignited had burned far beyond a single gift. It had illuminated truth, revealed greed, and ultimately restored balance. Justice had been done, not loudly, not recklessly, but perfectly. And in that quiet triumph, I finally understood the depth of the lesson life had offered me. Betrayal can wound, but wisdom and patience can heal. And sometimes, vengeance delivered with precision is sweeter than any gift under the Christmas tree. Looking back, I understand now that revenge is not about anger. It's about reclaiming control. Every late night of worry, every meticulous note, every quiet phone call, it was all preparation for the moment when truth could no longer be denied. I am free now. The past cannot touch me, and I have learned that silence, patience, and calculated action often speak louder than confrontation. I live quietly by the ocean. I am not rich, nor do I need to be, but I am safe, secure, and at peace. The people who tried to destroy me have been exposed, and their choices have defined them far more than my actions ever could. Family can love you, or they can sell you, but only you decide which they'll do first. If this story gave you chills, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Remember, justice isn't always loud, but it's always memorable. Sometimes the quietest victories are the sweetest.